Chapter 9 A Proposition. Tap tap tap. Tap tap. Ember shut his eyes more tightly and covered his ears. He hadn't slept, and he had a dreadful headache, whether from the lack of sleep or that endless parade of tangled, twisted fears which rattled around in his head was unclear. There was nothing he would have liked more than to convince himself that none of it was real, that it had all been some sort of bizarre and fanciful dream. And there was nothing he would have liked more than to see the woman from the river standing once more on his front doorstep, morning light shining on her sleek black hair. The longer he wrestled with his memories of the previous day, the more confused and agitated his thoughts became. It was in this frenzied state that Ember heard the tapping on the glass. And he did not need to lift his head and look to know that it hadn't been a dream, and a black-eyed river creature was standing at his window. Tap. A single, crisp tinking sound, as of a long fingernail rapping on glass. He kept his eyes closed for a moment, heart thumping against the mattress. Tap. Tap. Tap tap tap. How could she reach the window? The bottom sill was at least a head above him from the ground due to the elevated foundation. She must have crawled up the wall with her sticky paws somehow. Why wasn't she rapping at the door, like a normal person? Because she is not a person. And furthermore, because she wanted to see me. He found that quite alarming, but something had to be done. She had said she was returning, and now she was here, and he very much doubted she would give up and go away if she could see him, even a part of him, through the window. Ember clenched his fingers around the knife he'd hidden under his pillow and slowly drew it beneath himself, tucking it into his belt and pulling his shirt down to cover it. He had never undressed, never lain down with the intention of sleeping. Preparedness, he felt, was key. It wouldn't do at all to appear with the fishing spear again. Surely that would be too obvious. No, let her think he trusted her, for now. The knife would do in a pinch if he kept his wits about him. Could you really kill her, Ember? You had a chance to, remember? He started, tap 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 tap. She must have seen him move and knew he was awake. Slowly, very slowly, Ember opened his eyes and crawled out of bed, planting his feet on the floor and taking a deep breath to ground himself. He peered around the bed nook, toward the window, and swallowed once. Dew had collected along the lower panes, but through the dirt and dust and water droplets and the cobwebs he hadn't bothered to sweep away, he could see a shadow behind the glass, peering in with one hand shading her eyes and the other, presumably, holding on to the windowsill. When she saw him, she gave a little start of recognition and then dropped out of view. Light flooded the cabin in her absence. He heard grass rustling outside, and then the patter of bare feet on the flagstone and wooden step. Rap 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 came the knock on the door. Holding his breath a moment longer, Ember sat on the edge of the bed and deliberated. Her voice called out, muffled by the wooden planks. "Good morning, Ember." Ember shivered. "Is it?" he mumbled, getting up. "It is. For me or for you?" Ember approached the door as one might approach a sleeping bear, with all due caution, and his hand on the knife beneath his shirt. "What do you want?" There was a short pause. "I am liking to come in now, please." "I have a question to ask you first," Ember insisted. "Oh," she said, her voice shifting from impatient to curious. "What is it?" "I would like to know." Ember crouched down on the floorboards, somehow instinctively knowing that she had crouched on the other side. He stared at the door, imagining her big black eyes staring back at him. It wasn't difficult, now that he'd heard her voice again. "Yes? How many men have you eaten, exactly?" A bird twittered in the trees over his cabin, but not so much as a creak came from the wooden stoop outside his door. She was silent for so long he began to wonder if she hadn't left altogether. "Ember," she said, her voice wrapping itself around him like a warm blanket. "No harm will come to you. I already tell you this." "So tell me more," he muttered, finding it rather difficult to enunciate the words. He clenched the knife hilt. "How many people have you killed and eaten? Don't lie to me. I'll know." An empty threat. No doubt she could convince him of anything if she tried. "None," she said at last, and his entire body relaxed at the word. "I have never killed any of your kind, Ember." He had no way of knowing whether she had lied, but he would have to accept it or cower in his cabin for the rest of time. Or until she coaxed him out with her siren song. "Promise?" After a moment she repeated, "I will not eat you." Rising from his crouch, Ember glanced at the messy corner of the cabin, where all the hooks had been nailed into the wall and jars of edible goods shoved under fishing supplies and other odds and ends. He headed for the pile of cloaks he had never mended. Once there he tossed them all aside, snatched the unopened bottle of red wine he'd frivolously purchased 2 years ago, and popped off the cork with his thumb. Now was as good a time as ever. He took 3 big gulps straight out of the bottle, enjoying the cooling sensation and the slightly bitter taste of fermented plums, and then stuffed the cork back into it with a sigh. Thumping it hard on the table as he walked past, Ember headed for the door. He lifted the block of wood that barred the way, set it aside, and flung the door open before he lost his courage. A faint blur of motion caught his eye. Kentucky Flea stood straight as a reed, her hands by her sides. But he had opened the door quickly enough to guess that she must have been playing with her hair. She grinned at him. "Hello." "Hello." Ember waved her inside, trying not to let his eyes wander anywhere inappropriate. The jerkin had dark patches where water had seeped through, and it was obvious she had come out of the river and put on those clothes without bothering to dry off, and it had been a very short while ago. "Make yourself at home." Without a word Kentucky stole across the floor, leaving a trail of dark water stains behind her and no doubt accumulating some of the dirt and dried bits of grass that he habitually trailed in from the river. She seated herself in the same chair she had occupied the prior evening, and Ember meandered to the opposite side of the table, leaving the door wide open. It made him feel slightly less cornered. "So," he began, standing behind the other chair and resting his hands on the back of it. "What did you come here for? What do you want? You said you would tell me today." "I have." Kentucky hesitated, pressing her sticky fingers to the table and putting out her tongue for a moment. He suddenly noticed that she was eyeing the wine bottle. A proposition. Ember stared at her. He could think of nothing to say or do, but watched in silence as Kentucky licked her lips and reached for the wine. She popped the cork out of the top, sniffed at it, and then dipped a finger in it. A faint choking sound was all Ember could manage before Kentucky had stuck the finger in her mouth and was looking across the table at him. Her black eyes widened and she gave the finger a few more licks. "I apologize," she said hesitantly, slowly sticking the cork back in the bottle. A faint wrinkle appeared between her slender eyebrows. It was clear she did not know what, exactly, she was apologizing for. Ember shifted awkwardly and pointed to one of the dusty wooden tumblers on the shelf behind him and slightly to his left. "If you want some, please use that." Kentucky started to rise, but Ember had already reached out and snatched one, thumping it down on the table. "Sorry," he said, reddening. "What proposition?" "Oh." Kentucky seemed to perk up considerably at his interest, but instead of answering directly, she delicately uncorked the bottle and began to pour. In that moment, he thought, she looked almost human in the face, perhaps because she was looking down, hiding her eyes. He raised his eyebrows as she poured nearly the entire bottle's worth of wine into the cup, raised it to her lips, and took 8 big gulps. Sighing, she set it down again and smiled at him, her lips gleaming cherry red. "That is delicious." "I know," he said sourly. The siren's fingers twitched in the general direction of the bottle. Ember briefly considered snatching it away, but clenched his fists under the table and swallowed hard as she uncorked it for a third time, poured in the rest, and drank it all in front of him. A full week's wages. Gone. Only when she had drained the very last drop did she wipe her mouth with the back of her hand, give a little one-note hum of satisfaction that sent goosebumps shivering across the back of Ember's neck and shoulders, and proceed with the conversation. "Are you ever going to the very tall mountain? It has 2 heads." His stomach dropped to his shoes. "The sisters?" he murmured, all thoughts of the empty wine jar floating out the open door. She continued to smile. "That is a good name for it. You are very witty." I didn't make up that name." Ember faltered for a moment, every terrible story he'd ever heard about the sisters tripping through his mind. "No. I've never been there." Why do you ask? That is where we are going tonight. A proposition part 2. What? Wait. Ember scooted his chair back from the table, standing up and taking a full step back. His heart thudded. With an effort, he calmed his voice. We're not going, I'm not going anywhere tonight. Or tomorrow, or the next day, or any day. And definitely not to the sisters. Why not? She reached into the pocket of her trousers and pulled out the glowing stone that Ember had left on the doorstep. He recoiled. She placed it on the table and blinked at it, her eyes flitting back and forth as she absorbed every shifting color and swirl of light. Sisters is no place for decent folk, Ember muttered, glaring at the stone. Haven't you heard all the stories about that mountain? Kentucky pushed a strand of wet black hair away from her forehead, staring up at him with her buggish eyes, but made no reply. Either she was ignorant or playing at ignorance. Ember crossed his arms and glanced away. Travelers go missing on the mountain trails more often than any path through the valley, and the ones that make it back can't stop jabbering on about floating lights and pitfalls and venomous snakes and tainted spring water and ghost paths that look real until you take a step and fall right through to the bottom of some ravine, he added, remembering a few of Hunter's old stories. Those forests are full of mirages and magic. Nothing good comes from that mountain. Ever. Kentucky idly picked up the stone and smoothed it between her fingers, cupping her hands around it. Even in the morning light, the glow played across her face in angular patterns as she turned it this way and that. Why shall I fear such things? Because. He paused to lower his voice. Because those things can kill you. You, perhaps. Kentucky turned her cupped hand slightly, examining one of her claws and frowning at a thin scratch. Not me. Ember braced his palms on the table, waiting for her to make eye contact and, when she failed to do so, muttering, precisely. So if I were to accompany you, it's not hard to guess which of us would die of a venomous snake bite first. But I will be there to keep you safe, she said calmly, as if that should have been obvious. She set the stone between them on the table and tilted her chin up to look at him squarely. From broken bones and magic? Ember scoffed, rubbing his hand across his face to dispel the blurry haze of a sleepless night. Kentucky wiggled her fingers at him in response. I am not like you, Ember. Sirens are very familiar with magic. Perhaps you will use the word proficient. She smiled wide, clearly proud of her vocabulary. Listen, Kentucky, he stumbled slightly, unnerved by how casual his manner had become. A proposition is a proposition, and I've chosen to turn it down. No, no, and no. Wrong. The hair on the back of his neck and both arms stood on end. What do you mean, wrong? I mean, Kentucky said, tapping the stone, that you will assuredly come with me. I need not force you. You will come to your own conclusion. Ember leaned away from the table and watched her suspiciously. Why is it so important that I come with you? Kentucky pressed her lips together and hummed a tune that sent shivers crawling all over his body, avoiding his gaze. I absolutely will not go with you unless you tell me. She appraised him for a moment. I need you to open the door. Ember glanced at his own open door, taking in the golden morning light which crossed the river path, and then back to Kentucky. What? I need you to open the door. She squinted at him. Can you read? Not very. Yes, of course, he said, his ears growing hot. Well enough. Can you? I read the runes of my own people, she said primly, pinching a strand of wet hair and tucking it gently behind her ear. Not of yours. Your people. Ember bit his tongue, but curiosity got the better of him in the end. Your people, the river folk, have a written language. And a speaking tongue the likes of which you will never hear among your people. She rose, placing both palms flat on the table. You can read. This is good. You will come with me to the mountain, Ember. You've been there before, he surmised. Many times. It is a 2-day journey if we walk quickly. I'm not going. He shook his head, distant emotions that he did not like forming a lump in his throat. The look in her black eyes reminded him of the way he felt sometimes watching birds fly south for the winter, or snow melting off the mountains in the spring. It was a restless feeling, one of curiosity and peculiar excitement, and he banished it with a tired yawn. Find someone else to read your runes. There is a part of you, Ember, that will follow me no matter where I wander. Kentucky turned toward the door. Wait. Ember snatched the stone from the table and held it out to her stiffly. Take this. Take it far away from here, I don't want it in my house. He could have sworn he heard an echo of his mother's voice in those words. Kentucky's mouth turned down at the corners, making the lumps of her fangs more obvious, but she reached out and plucked the stone from his hand. If you would prefer it. She left his cabin without another word. Ember found himself begrudgingly drawn to the door again. Unlike yesterday, she still stood in the middle of the river path, half turned toward him. Her head was bowed low, the stone glowing on her neck and hands. When she looked up, he glimpsed that same hungry expression that had frightened him so badly the day before. A yearning. For what Ember did not know. After a short pause she continued down the river path, humming that odd melody, and Ember watched until he could no longer see her shadow on the packed dirt, or her long black hair swaying above the stalks of summer grass. Ember carried on with the day as usual after sleeping most of the morning away, but it was hard to ignore the presence that followed just a few steps behind him everywhere he went. Several times he caught her scent on a breeze, or turned around quickly and thought he saw movement behind some bush or in the tall grasses, but he could never be quite sure he had spotted her. He called to her, asking her to come out of her hiding places, but she did not. Whether she delighted in his consternation or truly thought he was stupid enough to believe she had left if she just stayed quiet was a mystery to Ember. Once, while digging around in the cool earth with his hands and pulling up weeds from the garden, he caught himself humming a frighteningly familiar melody. Ember never hummed to himself while he worked, though he did talk a great deal. Disconcerted, he stopped humming and dug his fingers into the soil, a grounding, tactile motion that tethered his mind to his work again. Regardless, her words that morning were taking root in his mind. And he had to admit she was right, there was a part of him that would follow her to the ends of the earth and back, out of simple fascination and the allure of something. There were aspects of Kentucky Vlee that he found hideous, certainly. Her big black eyes, her fangs, her clammy skin. But her body was the body of a young woman. And she smelled like flowers. Ember wearily rubbed his eyes with the back of his wrist. If that's all it takes to win my trust, I have some thinking to do. Chapter 10 Confrontation. The days which followed were some of the strangest that Ember could recall. He had grown used to living alone in the passing of the seasons since his sister had left. The woods were never silent, but the eyes which watched him had always been those of the smaller skittery sort. The birds in the trees had never included him in their gossiping, unless it was to whistle and scold for straying too close to a nest. And the mudbugs along the river bank never paid him heed, unless they had the misfortune of being caught up in one of his traps. Now he was in constant company. No longer was Kentucky an unseen watcher in the woods when he walked the path to town, or merely a passing scent on the spring breeze. She had a name, a form, a voice. When their paths crossed, she wore the same threadbare clothes and various states of dampness. Sometimes she looked as if she had just emerged from the water, drenched and dripping. Other times her hair seemed to have dried in the sun. Once or twice he caught her lacing up the last few knots of her jerkin, which brought a flush to his face. In the mornings he was often startled to see her sunning herself in the branches of the old oak tree, a perch from which she hummed a quiet tune under her breath and observed him as he gathered his nets. In the afternoons he glimpsed her picking and eating the incorrigible chickweed which grew along his garden fence, or turning his basket traps upside down and confiscating the unfortunate mudbugs, which were cracked in half and devoured with an alarming swiftness. And in the evenings, when he sat at his table with the door open and a candle lit, mending his nets or sitting in thought and listening to the river, he would hear the patter of damp bare feet on the stone, and the wooden step would creak quietly as a shadow stole before his door. "Ember," she would whisper. "Will you come away tonight?" The first night, Ember had merely offered a firm shake of his head. Remorse stung his soul that he had, perhaps, disappointed the enchanting creature, and fear at what retaliation might await him. But she merely faded away into the rustling trees. The second night she asked again, and he pretended not to have heard. But on the third night, Kentucky did not go away. She sighed a few simple words in a lilting voice. He recognized a nightingale's tune, the familiarity of which quieted his trepidation of her siren magic. "Ember, catcher of fine fish? Morrow, he will come. 'Tis but a little thing she wish, Ember, he will come." He shivered. In the empty stillness which followed, it became apparent that the night birds, crickets, and frogs down by the river had fallen deathly silent. The most sensible thing to do, of course, was to carry on with his very ordinary life as he always had, and pray the Sirena did not eat him out of spite. Not one soul in recent memory had braved the treacherous paths of the sisters and returned wholly sane. He had to admit that even the old wayfarer Hunter Manson, a man he had always admired, was slightly cracked in the head. Only a fool would accompany her to that mountain, and Ember felt he had made himself a fool far too often as of late. Tomorrow he would make his habitual trip into town to sell whatever mudbugs Kentucky had not eaten, and purchase a few baked goods to last him the rest of the week. Then he would step inside, bolt the door, and sleep very soundly in his own bed in his cozy cabin beside the river. No doubt he would awaken at sunrise the next morning to get an early start on patching that leaky roof. Given time, the townsfolk would begin to trust him again. Then he could sell his fish for a reasonable amount of coin, earning enough to keep himself fed and comfortable that winter, and speak to Isabel Furley in the square on market days. The thought brought a hint of a smile to his lips as he remembered her soft touch, the rare, clear sound of her laughter, and the goodly earthiness of her scent. "No, I will not come with you." He opened his mouth to say as much. A displeased hum emanated through the door, shivering through the floorboards, the wooden chair, and his bones. The back of his neck prickled and he sat up. The nets he had been mending crumpled to the floor. "One more day," he begged, suddenly afraid that she would leave him. "I need some time to think. That wasn't what I meant to say at all." No sooner had he blinked than she was gone. It required every bit of willpower he possessed not to get up and bolt out the door after her. He remained in the chair, every muscle taut, mind whirling. For a long while after, Ember sat alone in the dark beside a sputtering candle. A hazy sunrise greeted him as he strolled down the path to check his traps. Mist had rolled in along the riverbank, but no shimmering mirage reclined within the branches of the gnarled oak tree. He was alone. Kentucky's otherworldly presence had been so constant in the past few days that he was acutely aware of her absence. That floral musk was beginning to fade, and he heard no unusual splashes and creaks, nor sticky bare feet rustling in the grass. He couldn't shake the suspicion that he had angered her somehow. That notion hung over him like a pall, and Hunter's warning echoed loudly in his mind: they do not easily forget a face which has wronged them. He kept his spear slung over his shoulder, half hoping to catch a glimpse of her and half fearing that he would not hear her approach. As the sun reached its mid-afternoon height, glowing upon the mist which lay low along the river path, Ember trudged back to his cabin. No sooner had he removed his fishing spear than there was a wooden creak. Ember froze, clutching the weapon, and glanced into a darkened corner. The Sirena stood beside his cupboard, two black claws pinching the edge of the handle as if she had been about to open it. With an air of refined purposefulness, as if she had not been caught in the act of rummaging through his home, she took 2 steps toward the table, lifted her chin, and smoothed her hands along her waist. Her thick black hair appeared somewhat drier than usual, and Ember noted that it was tangled with little leaves and pieces of dried grass, as if she had been wandering the woods behind his cabin. "Ember," she greeted him softly. Despite his best efforts to be annoyed, her voice melted him. He offered a shrug. "Hello. I was looking for you this morning." A note of accusation crept into his tone. "I want to see if it is good to leave tonight," she informed him, placing one hand upon the table. "I do not find anything to trouble me." He swallowed tightly, setting the spear aside. "You're going to the mountain?" "Perhaps," she murmured coyly. "I cannot return unless I find a way to read the runes." "Ah." He shifted in place. An awkward pause. "I shall be waiting on the river path when the moon arises." Kentucky looked up with her dark eyes and blinked twice, slowly. Meet me there, and we shall go together to the mountain with two heads. As I say before, the choice shall be your own." Ember took a deep breath to steady himself. He was about to reply, but Kentucky's ears flickered. She pressed a finger to her chin, her eyes shifting toward the open doorway, and Ember instinctively fell silent. For a moment, he heard nothing. Then a faint crunch of dirt under boot. The steps were scuffling, slow, and paused several times. A man's stride, he thought. Sudden alarm heightened his senses. It would not do to be caught unawares, with one of the river folk in his cabin no less. Something had shifted between himself and his neighbors. An unspoken mistrust, on both counts. Perhaps Isabel had been right to scold him for his lack of caution. "Wait here," Ember hissed. He rose from the chair and moved swiftly to the door. There he paused and, as an afterthought, grabbed his fishing spear. Dismay at his own reaction prompted a cold sweat. He had never before armed himself when any of the townsfolk came to visit. Still, he assured himself weakly, best not to take any chances. As he stepped down onto the flagstone, he saw Wildlife standing awkwardly beside the tall grasses, arms at his sides. He was glancing about with a nervous quickness, but his wide eyes fastened on Ember with a little start as he noticed him. "Ah. Yes, Ember." Ember planted the dull end of his fishing spear into the dirt and leaned on it slightly, frowning at him. "You seem surprised to see me." The farmer scratched the back of his neck, chewing his cheek. Yes, well, no. What I'm meaning to say is, I hadn't seen you about town in a goodly while, and we thought. Well, I thought maybe. I came to see as you were still alive and well. It wasn't the whole truth, that much was certain. Just you?" Ember glanced down the path. "Yes. As you can see," he announced dryly, "I am alive." Yes, I see that." Wildlife shrugged and shifted his weight to the other foot. He seemed as if he was about to say more, but he glanced over Ember's shoulder, his gaze drifting slightly up and to the left. His face paled. As a faint breeze swirled through the mist, Ember turned to see a pale face peering inquisitively around the doorframe, still dripping river water. Black strands of hair clung to an oily neck and lips parted in soft surprise, revealing the tips of two glistening fangs against a bluish tongue. He saw her, in that moment, as Wildlife must have seen her, indeed, as Ember himself had seen her not a week ago, standing on that very stoop. A ghastly river sprite. The lanky farmer let out a plaintive yelp and sprinted back up the path. Ember dashed after him, spear in hand. "Wildlife," he shouted. "Wait." A wail of terror drifted through the mist. "Wait, come back. I can explain," but the farmer had already disappeared. Panting furiously, Ember took a sudden turn and darted through the long grass beside the river, splashing through the shallows before leaping up the pebbly bank on the opposite side. A barely perceptible deer trail led through the tall birch trees, and he moved through the forest with a rustling swiftness, silent enough to pass unnoticed by men, though the keen-eared forest creatures scurried thither and yon as he rushed past. When the deer trail met the bend in the river path, Ember heard boots crunching on dirt and pebbly stones. He leapt forward, spreading out his hands. Wildlife skidded to a halt, fumbling to keep his balance, and Ember took the opportunity to say quickly, "Please, let me explain. It's not what you think." He was surprised and a little frightened to see the grown man's chin tremble faintly. Guilt racked his chest, and tangled with a righteous flush of anger. That shocked him. He couldn't remember the last time he had been truly angry with anyone. The idea of anyone but himself laying eyes on his mysterious companion unsettled him, but he had also long considered Wildlife a friend, and the slack-jawed disgust and fear on his face was too much. There was no use trying to deceive him. "You can't tell anyone," he huffed. "Not a single soul. Do you hear?" A whistling wheeze was the only reply, and both of them stared wildly at one another, breathless. "The people in town already shun me. I won't be able to set foot in the market square if you tell them Ember Jarlson is consorting with the river folk." Ember's hand shook on the spear, and he tightened his grip. "I always counted you a friend. Do you want me to starve come winter?" while Ivory regarded everyone in town with a contradiction of gullibility and suspicion. Nonetheless, he had always treated Ember kindly, even allowing him to pick the first of the apples from his orchards in the fall. "Please, while Ivory," Ember whispered, heart pounding. The farmer gave a quick, nervous shake of his head, mumbling something inaudible, and edged toward the woods. They slowly circled one another. Once he was reasonably clear of the fishing spear, while Ivory bolted down the path, and was soon overtaken by mist and the noonday shadows of the woods. Ember stared after him with a feeling of sinking dread, and then stumbled back to his cabin in a bleary-eyed daze, dirt and brambles clinging to the soles of his river-wet feet. Kentucky was nowhere to be seen. Ember unsprung the fishing trap from its posts, numbly, and dragged both the net and the mudbug baskets back to the cabin. The net he hung outside on his cabin wall to dry, and the baskets he set beside the stoop. Once inside, he stripped the blanket from his bed and grabbed one of his newly woven baskets, carefully tucking away all the food from his cupboard. 1.5 loaves of bread from town, a few remaining apples, and the rest of the pilfered honey jar. Then he marched out to the garden and gathered all the greens which looked ready for eating. He would have to eat those first, as they would spoil the quickest. It wasn't until he sat down at the table to rest that he realized he was too light-headed to still be reeling from the excitement of his unwanted encounter with the farmer. Once or twice he got up to look out the door, but from that spot he watched the sunset colors spread behind the trees and touch the silvery surface of the river. And it was there that he sat when a slender shadow crept up to the stoop, blotting out the light of the full summer moon in the doorway. Neither of them said a word. Ember thought of a few, but his tongue would not form them, so he silently grabbed the fishing spear on his way past and slung it across his back. The rotting wooden step cracked under his foot as if to kick him out the door, and he pitched forward, stumbling onto the flagstone and narrowly avoiding an embarrassing fall. If it was a sign, it was one that he wasn't sure how to interpret. Kentucky's fangs glittered white in the darkness. "I knew you will follow," she whispered. An owl hooted over their heads. Ember could only nod stiffly. His teeth would have been chattering if he hadn't clenched his jaw, and the muscles in his face were starting to ache. "Come, Ember." She moved through the trees like a wispy sprite, following an obscure path which even Ember could not discern, and occasionally pausing to glance over her shoulder. He followed close behind, one step after the other, the blanket slung over his shoulder, basket on his arm, and one hand desperately clenching the knife under his shirt. "What am I doing?" he thought to himself. And he had no good answer. Only the faraway look in Kentucky Vlee's eyes, and a curious stirring in his heart. Chapter 11 Tainted. Ember was surprised, and somewhat relieved, when Kentucky slunk out of sight through the branches, and he brushed them aside to find himself standing in a little gully beside one of the main roads. "We'll be following man-made paths," he concluded, stepping out of the brambles and readjusting the basket on his arm. "For a while," she said, smiling at him. The moon silvered a few errant strands of her hair, and he noted that it had an oily shine even when she wasn't dripping wet. "When we reach the end of this one, there are other paths we may take." He had just opened his mouth to ask what sort of paths those might be when a shout startled him into silence. "Ember." Kentucky's head swiveled at the same time as Ember's, and he snatched the spear from his back. It was a woman's voice. "Ember, where are you?" The call echoed from some distance away, nearer his cabin. Stricken, he glanced at Kentucky, who widened her glossy eyes at him. "Ember." "Isabel." His gut wrenched. Something was terribly awry if Isabel Era's daughter was looking for him, of all people, in the dead of night. "Over here," he shouted back, taking a step back the way they had come. A loud hiss yanked his attention back to Kentucky Vlee, who bared her fangs and wrinkled her nose at him. The sudden switch in demeanor chilled him to the bone. He shoved his tattered blanket into her arms. She accepted it without a word, but her black stare accused him, of what, he wasn't sure. "I have to be certain everything's all right," he explained. "Cover yourself. Hurry." Twigs snapped in the distance and a light bobbed into view, flickering between the trees. "Ember?" she called faintly. "Is that you?" Some part of Ember still wished to snatch the Sirena's hand and run as far away from this place as he could, but he couldn't decide if it was the more or less reasonable part of him. So, without stopping to think, he handed Kentucky the basket and unslung his fishing spear from his shoulders, hurrying back into the undergrowth to meet Isabel. "It's me," he assured her, keeping the spear lowered. "What are you doing here?" Her face was as white as a ghost in the lantern light, and she held the little flame before her like a shield. "Ember," Isabel whispered, hurrying through the thickets. Her hair had been hastily piled up on her head, dark strands flying loose around her face, and she was wearing a rumpled frock that looked as if she had flown out of bed and fastened it up on her way out the door. "Ember, you." He noticed something glinting at her hip. She had slipped a cutlery knife under her belt. "Is there trouble?" Isabel took a deep breath and put a hand on her hip. "Yes. Why, Lifery's been all over town this afternoon spreading rumors." She paused to collect herself, swallowing once, and her eyes narrowed. "He says he saw one of the river folk yesterday." Ember couldn't stop himself from glancing over his shoulder. Kentucky stood tall and still as a sapling rooted in the middle of the road, the blanket cowling her head and shoulders and her claws digging into the material. The latticework of low-hanging branches somewhat obscured her, but the moment his eyes met the shadow where hers should have been, her grip on the blanket tightened warningly. When he turned back to Isabel, her face had gone several shades whiter. He moved to block her view. "What else did he say?" Ember demanded, more harshly than he meant to. She put a hand on the knife and flattened her mouth. "That it put a spell on you." Ember's heart dropped in his chest. The owl hooted again, echoing from the river, and Isabel flinched. "With all your strange talk of late, it's no surprise they took him at his word." He described the creature in great detail. She brushed a wisp of hair out of her eyes and craned her neck to peer around Ember. "Alden riled them up," she muttered. "He said you brought the river folk to our village, that you have their taint upon you, and that you'd be the death of us. I'll wager they're at your doorstep right now, and Ember, I'm afraid they may do something irrational." Ember took a step back, lifting the spear. His heart drummed in his ears, masking the sound of the crickets and rustling leaves underfoot. "They're farmers, not bandits," he scoffed. "I've known them all for years." "Not this side of them, you haven't," snapped Isabel, waving a hand toward the road. He glanced back and noticed that Kentucky had moved closer, half hidden behind one of the trees. She observed the two of them from beneath the blanket, quiet and watchful. "I try to stay out of such matters, but common sense failed me tonight. If you hadn't gone wagging your tongue all over town, they might have laughed at my Lifery and gone back to their drinks." "What about you?" Ember hesitated, now thoroughly upset. He still wasn't entirely convinced that Kentucky had his best interests at heart, but now that the townsfolk knew of her existence and it was at least partly his own fault, he felt obligated to shield her from further scrutiny. "They don't know I ran ahead," she said stiffly, her eyes flitting to the road again. "I'll take the long way back to my farm." A torch flickered into view behind Isabel and something heavy crunched through the underbrush. She sucked in a breath and swatted a few cobwebs out of her path, sidling closer to Ember. "Now take your mysterious friend and get out," she whispered, "before they chase her off and beat you senseless." She reached toward him, as if to give his shoulder a reassuring pat, but drew back at the last moment. Her reticence spoke louder than words. Ember's stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. "Tainted." Shuddering, Isabel hiked up her skirts and hurried away into the bushes, covering the lantern with her cloak and plunging him into darkness and shifting moonbeams again. He glanced at the torchlight before scrambling out of the dense underwood, back to Kentucky. A gruff voice shouted his name from the forest, and another shout echoed up the road. "Why, Ember! Where'd you get off to?" Kentucky reached out and pressed a finger to his wrist. Her cool touch calmed him, like water rushing over a smoldering fire. "Where's she, Ember? You can't hide from us. Where is the river rat?" He slung the spear over his shoulder, snatched the basket away, and dashed up the road toward the crest of the hill. The Sirena pattered along beside him, blanket swept back on her shoulders and her hair flying wildly around her face. A rock bounced off a tree to Ember's left and he heard footsteps on the road behind them. "Traitor!" roared Alden in his familiar baritone. "Get back here!" He didn't entertain the idea, not for a moment, that he could defeat the burly tavern keeper and half a dozen grown men with a fishing spear. "She'll kill you in your sleep," Lunder screeched. "Tear the flesh from your bones." He stumbled. The basket came close to flying out of his hands, but Kentucky reached out with inhuman quickness and saved the contents from hitting the ground, delicate fingers spreading across the basket to preserve his foodstuffs. "Hurry, Ember, hurry," she chanted. "Hurry, hurry, hurry." Rather than fumbling in his haste, her voice propelled him onward with a lightness of foot that he hadn't known he possessed. His grip on the basket tightened and the hill no longer seemed so steep nor so daunting. She gave a soft and urgent hum that filled the air, leaving no room for the frantic shouts and screams. Another rock pelted the road at his heels, but it seemed peripheral, unworthy of his attention. The landscape blurred around them as he ran, leaving only 2 points of focus, the end of the hill where the road met the starry sky, jagged trees rising up on either side, and the shadow of the Serena sprinting beside him on silent feet. It wasn't until they had left the rocks and torches far behind, and were nearing the top of yet another hill, that Ember at last began to feel safe. The townsfolk were too superstitious to follow this road much further without turning off onto one of the overgrown paths, most of which led to remote farmhouses. He kept pace with Kentucky, or Kentucky kept pace with him, pausing only to brush aside clouds of summer gnats and clamber over a recently downed tree in the road. When they reached the summit, Ember finally slowed down. "Kentucky," he said breathlessly, only then aware that his legs were shaking. "Where are we going?" "Far from here," she promised. An acrid, pitchy smell stung his nostrils, and Ember instinctively looked to the sky. Smoke rose above the trees in a thin column, blotting out the starlight. He stopped in his tracks, the basket sagging in his arms. "My cabin." He could barely see the winding river from the top of the hill, and through the trees a faint glow reflected on the water's surface. Ember stared, transfixed, as the curl of smoke grew into a tower. His eyes burned. "Come away, Ember," Kentucky whispered, touching his hand again. "All will be well." But not even a siren's voice could sweep away the vision which beset him. It only twisted the shock, the pain, into a dull, listless grief. His little cabin was burning to the ground, and he could do nothing to stop it. Pointless terror streamed down his face, blurring the far-off flicker of firelight. His nets, his baskets, his bed and his home. All the little trinkets he had found by the river. The drafty fireplace and the roof that leaked in the winter. His oft-neglected garden beside the cabin. Hazy memories of warm summer afternoons, sitting on the stoop and making crowns of forest flowers with his sister. "I can't go back now," he thought miserably, squeezing his eyes shut. "It's all gone." If he ever returned, if he did try to explain, what would they do to him? Burn him alive in the ashes of his own house? Drown him in one of his own nets? Yesterday he could not have imagined either of those fates, much less at the hands of the villagers. But he wouldn't have believed they could torch his cabin, either. Kentucky herself said nothing further. She made no apology and offered him no words of consolation. Instead, she readjusted the blanket on her shoulders, discreetly avoiding his gaze and picking at a few loose threads. She paused briefly, tilting her head to listen to a particularly obnoxious cricket, and then pressed one corner of the fabric against her nose and sniffed. He had no words to explain how he felt, and he doubted that she would understand him anyway. "Let's go," Ember muttered, hugging the basket and turning his back on the burning remnants of his livelihood. Kentucky fell back to walking at his side, silent and grave. She glanced up at him curiously every now and then, her large eyes dark and full of stars. Perhaps she did not know that, deep in his soul, he blamed her for his loss. He hoped not. For good or ill, this strange creature was now his only friend. Chapter 12 Waterfall Luncheon. When Ember lay down to rest, he wished for dreams to overtake him. But none did, and what little slumber he'd gotten passed like the blinking of an eye. He fell asleep to Kentucky's restful humming and the creatures of the night skittering around them, and woke to morning bird calls and sunlight glowing on the backs of his eyelids. "Can't go back," was his first grim thought. The fishing spear was still clenched in his hand, and when he let go his fingers cramped. He lay there for a moment, massaging some circulation back into his hand. I might never see Isabel again, he realized, a sudden sense of loss overtaking him again. Nor any of the other farmers, and their wives, and children. In that moment, he noticed he was wrapped very snugly in a blanket. It had, at some point in the night, been fastidiously tucked underneath him, all the edges poked under his legs and torso and bundled around his feet in a sort of cocoon. He opened his eyes. The side was vision-smeared slightly, and then brightened enough for him to see where he was. Not safe and snug at home in his cabin, but in the woods in the middle of a sunlit clearing. A clearing which smelled of crushed flower petals. Ember sat up, scrubbing at his face. His eyes were swollen and crusty, and his hair was all askew and full of tree needles. A faint rustle drew his attention to the edge of the clearing, and he saw Kentucky sitting with her back to him, delicately picking items out of his basket and placing them in the dried summer grass. "What are you doing?" Her head snapped around. The jar of honey fell to the ground with a dull thud, and she simply stared at him with her fathomless black eyes. Then she lifted the basket, turned it upside down, and shook it slightly as if to ensure there was nothing else inside. "You make this?" she asked, her voice a balm to his raw nerves. Grunting, Ember stood and shook out the blanket, flinging bits of grass and dirt every which way. "Yes. It's time-consuming, but not difficult." "Ah." Kentucky traced a finger over the woven reeds. "You are very clever." Ember gave her a weary glance before returning his focus to the blanket. He folded it in squares, rolled it up neatly, then knelt and began to gather into a little pile all the items she had discarded. She regarded him for a moment, and then ducked her gaze, tracing the woven handle with a finger. "Very clever," she murmured, as if reassuring herself of it. Wordless, he extended a hand. Kentucky blinked down at the basket, and then set it gently on the ground without looking up. She was, he thought, disappointed that her compliment had failed to elicit any response. Ember tugged the basket a bit closer, tossing the blanket into it. Then he began to replace all the items which Kentucky had plucked out. He paused when he got to the bread. His stomach gurgled. Sighing, he flicked away a greedy ant, tore off a little piece, and offered it to her. "Are you hungry?" A pair of bulbous eyes flickered up to his, and she delicately pinched the piece of bread in 2 fingers. Her stare was piercing and suspicious, a question with no words. Then she crammed the bread into her mouth and stood suddenly. "We must leave now." Ember took 2 large bites, slinging the basket over his arm and stumbling to his feet. "Right. Your door in the mountain." "It is not my door," she corrected him. "It is the mountain's door." He paused, thinking. "Is it a door that leads into the mountain?" "You will see." "You keep saying that," Ember muttered, snatching up his fishing spear. "What kind of door is it, and why do you need to open it?" She was already trotting off toward the road. "I think," she called over her shoulder, "that is a song best left for walking, and not standing." Ember sighed and hurried after her. As they stepped onto the overgrown wagon ruts, he couldn't help glancing up at the 2 craggy peaks, which appeared far closer than they had the previous night. They glared down at him in the morning sunlight, patterns of melting snow forming strange shapes on their faces. A wispy cloud rolled below the mountain, weaving in and out of the foothills and obscuring any paths that might be seen from this distance. He wondered what it would be like to be working there instead of wandering along the flat stretch of the road, up in the heights, where the trees were sparse and the cliffs very sheer. He resisted the temptation to glance back over his shoulder to see if any smoke still lingered above the trees. If he kept his gaze straight ahead, he could almost forget what had happened. "The door," he prompted. "Where does it lead?" Kentucky responded to his question with a question of her own. "What songs do you sing among yourselves about the mountain with 2 heads?" He shrugged, yawning so hard his eyes watered. "You heard what I said before, didn't you? People get lost up there and never return. The ones who do say it's a cursed mountain, teeming with ghosts and goblins and the like." "Goblins?" Nasty things. Never seen one, but some of the villagers swear they pilfer their crops. He trailed off, thinking of some of the stories he'd heard in the tavern and feeling a pang in his chest. The memory caught under his ribs, pained him for a moment, and then faded as he let out a deep sigh. They are like river folk, I suppose, but not nearly so beautiful, and I've never heard a story where they sing. They do not sound at all like river folk, she said primly, plucking an unfortunate beetle that had landed on her shoulder and popping it into her mouth. She crunched on it for a few seconds, swallowed, then added, and they do not exist. They don't? Kentucky shrugged. If such a creature lives, I will be seeing it. That caught his attention. What makes you say that? I live many summers. The siren held up all 10 fingers, then closed her hands into fists and opened them up again. She did this 10 times, and then held up 2 fingers. Ember stared at her in disbelief. 102? I am young. That stumped him for a few minutes. Then he ventured, that's old. I heard of a woman who lived to be 185, but she died blind and toothless. Most of us don't live past 100. Kentucky tilted her head. How old are you? He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. It made him feel suddenly vulnerable in light of her own age. 21. If I'm lucky I'll live 100 years, supposing this venture doesn't kill me first. He squinted down at her. How long will you live? I do not know, she said. Would you like to hear my story about the mountain now? He was under the impression that she was eager to change the subject, but he found the mountain of equal interest, and did not press her. Yes, of course. Very good. She clapped her hands once, grinning at him, and hopped a step. The sisters are hollow. Ember stifled another yawn. Hollow. Yes. She pointed at both peaks, singling out the taller one first. Men live in that mountain long ago. He smirked a little, slinging the spear across his back. Goblins, you mean? No. Men like you. Of all the rumors he had heard about the sisters, that surprised Ember the most. The farmers he had spoken with made no mention of anyone dwelling there aside from mischievous sprites and goblins, which were, according to them, as plentiful there as rabbits were in the lowlands. Men live there, Ember repeated, struck cold by the idea. How can you be sure? These tales pass out of your reckoning, but my people remember, and we tell stories about it. Hunter's words returned to him. They are obsessed with mankind, you know. You do? Yes. Men are familiar with magic, once. We were. Ember exclaimed, thoroughly interested. Now you are simple creatures, she sniffed, but once men hear the music in the earth as I do, and understand it. And the ones who live before you capture it and fashion it into many wonderful things. Ember could hardly even imagine this to be true, but if the sirens lived to be older than 100, they would naturally remember more than men about centuries past. So he asked, what sort of things? You will not understand them, she said loftily, glancing at him out of the corner of her eye and lifting her chin. He felt rather offended, but also wondered if the remark was a front for her own ignorance. There is no magic left in your people, but there is magic in the mountain. Beautiful things are hidden there. And what do you want with these beautiful things? He challenged. What right to them do you have? If this mountain really belongs to men, shouldn't men decide what to do with it? She snuck a few wilted leaves out of his basket and munched on them, savoring each bite. That is why you are here, she explained around the cheekful of greens. But you've tried to get in before, Ember surmised, peering hard at her. On your own. She hummed evasively. Waterfall Luncheon Part 2. We're going to be working together all day, he pointed out, so you might as well tell me something. There was a lull in the conversation, and while Kentucky thought, he watched the sunrise turn from golden to a beautiful lurid pink. Then she reached down into her jerkin and withdrew the small glowing stone she had set on his stoop 2 nights ago. This comes from the mountain, she said. I know. Hunter brought a stone like that back from his travels once. A hunter? She smiled. Ember faintly returned her smile, in spite of himself. Of a sort, yes, I suppose he is. He must be courageous. Kentucky held the stone up to the sunrise glow, and Ember watched the amber light swirl within it. "These are plentiful, but the mountain paths are very sly. It doesn't look like mountain rock to me," Ember said skeptically, reaching out to touch it. The coolness of it under his finger woke him up a bit. "This is polished river rock." Kentucky handed it to him and he covered it with his fingers, marveling at the ruddy light that shone through his skin. "Dim, but noticeable. These are polished by hand," she explained, "but there are many more inside the mountain. They grow there. They grow there." Ember frowned and handed her the stone, and she tucked it away again. "That sounds a bit far-fetched." She shrugged. "This is what I am told." "What if we open the door and there's nothing there?" he posed. "Then what?" The silence that followed was so long that he realized she must not have even considered it a possibility. He kicked a pebble down the road, waiting. "Then I am told many lies," she said at last. They walked in silence until the sun reached its noonday height, Kentucky swiping everything edible from the roadside and occasionally sticking her hand into Ember's basket for another leaf, and Ember entertaining himself with glimpses of wildlife and the changing of the scenery. He thought of his cabin now and then, but eventually shoved it aside in favor of other, more important concerns, primarily what he would do and where he would go once this odd adventure was over. Did Kentucky have other plans for him, or was he merely here to open the door in the mountain? Once his usefulness was ended, what would she do with him? "What if I fail?" he thought, momentary panic rising in his throat. The further they walked, the narrower the road became. At the hottest part of the day, when sweat began to drip off Ember's nose and the buzzing choir of insects was nearly unbearable, they reached a point where it became more of a trail than a road. They were just beginning an upward climb when Kentucky veered off and ran up a little deer path, branches swaying in her wake. "Come, this way," she called excitedly. He was parched and his feet were already aching, but her voice drew him onward and upward with renewed vigor. He doggedly followed her through a copse of birches and up a small ridge that overlooked the path. It wasn't long before he could hear running water, and the summer foliage grew lush and green underfoot. Ember swept aside a curtain of needled branches and emerged into a tiny paradise of white spray, jagged gray stones, and a thick bed of flowery moss. A little clearing sprawled out before him, bordered by a wall of rock. Inside was trees. Rays of sunlight streamed through the branches, glistening on wet foliage, and a white tumbling waterfall splashed over boulders and rocky ledges. The garden of moss dropped off into a steep downward slope to his left. Kentucky was gone. "Hello," Ember said cautiously, setting the basket down and unslinging his fishing spear. He heard a splash and glanced at the waterfall, but saw only frothing white water and a rocky ledge. It was then that he noticed a pair of brown breeches draped over a shrubby bush. Her jerkin lay a few paces away in the moss, as if she had carelessly tossed them aside and dived in. Turning bright red, Ember set the spear down and looked away, rubbing a hand across his stubble and trying to figure out where to rest his eyes. Splash! Cold water droplets sprinkled his arm. He glanced at the ledge and saw a blur of motion. Kentucky had plopped herself down on one of the rocks directly under the torrent, hidden by the spray except for an occasional flash of black hair or a pale elbow. Dirt and dust and tree needles rolled away in the falls, and when her hands flashed into view the water added a luster to her skin that Ember had never seen before. It shimmered in lovely rainbow hues, reminding him of an abalone shell one of the villagers had brought back from the sea. She stuck her head out of the downpour and grinned at him before disappearing entirely. He heard her bare hands and feet pattering on wet rock, but she always remained just out of sight, a shadow under sunlit water, darting here and there with a startling quickness. Forcing himself to look away, Ember hurried to the rocky ledge and clambered onto one of the less slippery-looking boulders, cupping his hands under the running water. The first sip was delightfully cool and set him tingling from head to toe. Never had he taken a drink that tasted so good and pure. It had to be summer runoff from the mountain peaks. He drank until he was sated and his cracking lips were soothed, and then retreated across the glen to fill his empty stomach. Not long after, he noticed Kentucky slinking behind the bank, eyeing her clothes, and he tactfully glanced down at the bread he was eating. She snagged them with a thin wet arm and disappeared. Moments later, she scampered across the clearing, now arrayed in her jerkin and trousers. She sat down a few paces away, water still dripping from her chin, and set about arranging her thick wet hair so that it hung evenly over both shoulders. He swallowed, and then reached for the last loaf of bread with a wince. It wasn't going to last as long as he'd hoped. She watched in silence as he tore off a large piece, plopped it in his lap, and uncorked the jar of honey. Her ears twitched with each new sound, and her eyes followed every movement of his hands. Sighing, he stuffed the bread into the jar and scraped some of the remaining honey off the glass before shoving it into his mouth. MMH. It was too much to chew politely, and he had to swallow it in pieces, but there was no one here to impress. Kentucky had set a precedent of very little etiquette and the barest modicum of modesty, which was, no doubt, very decent by Siren standards. "I wonder," she murmured with a stealthy glance at his provisions, "what it is that makes your honey taste so sweet?" "You'll have to ask the bees," Ember grunted, digging a little more honey out of the jar with his half-eaten piece of bread. "They're the ones that made it. And it's too sweet to eat plain. It's best for stirring into porridge or spreading on breads." "I prefer to lick it plain," Kentucky said bluntly. "It does not taste too sweet to me." Ember stopped chewing and looked up at her. "Did you lick it out of this jar?" She smiled and drew her bluish tongue across her lips. "I tell you, it is delicious." With an effort, Ember swallowed the rest of the bread and stared down at the fresh coating of honey in dismay. Kentucky patted a stray lock of hair back into place and glanced up at the branches overhead. "What?" "Never mind," he growled, tossing the defiled bread in her direction and reaching for an unhoneyed piece. "Oh." She widened her eyes at him. "You will not be eating the rest of the honey?" "I suppose not," Ember said, glaring. Kentucky popped his unfinished piece of bread into her mouth, snagged the jar, and uncorked it with a little sound of delight. "I will finish it for you." And Ember could not tell, for the Siren's emotions and manners of expression were still so foreign to him, whether she had been truly ignorant of human niceties or whether he had been cheated out of his bread and honey luncheon. By the time evening shadows stretched across the path and the drone of 1,000 insects had dwindled to a few cheeping crickets, the way had grown much steeper. It wound around little hummocks and thick patches of woodland. A few much smaller waterfalls trickled down rocky outcroppings, and occasionally Ember stopped for a drink. Kentucky stopped at each one, flinging water over her bare skin and combing it through her hair. He heard something very faint echoing down from the mountain twice that evening, almost a bird call, but not like any bird he knew. Shivery and strange, it echoed around the foothills far longer than it should. Yet each time it died away, he immediately questioned whether he had really heard anything at all. As the first stars began to appear above the trees, Kentucky drifted a bit closer, glancing up at him frequently as if she wished to say something. "Ember," she ventured at length, "I do not know much of your kind, but you are not solitary." "No," he agreed, bemused. "Not by nature." "You are," she continued, "very fond of your nests." And Ember slowly understood. "I think most people are. In this valley, farms are usually passed down among families." He glanced down at her. "Do your people not have homes?" "At last," she said, "I wonder." And that was the end of it. Though he waited for her to make some mention of his loss, there was none forthcoming. She merely walked, and thought, and hummed now and then. Each time she hummed it eased the tightness in his chest a little more. A few straggling fireflies appeared as dusk began to settle, and the trail they followed faded in and out of the woods alarmingly often. Had the Siren not been there, Ember knew he would have lost the way altogether. Her slinking presence was far less frightful than the unfamiliar shadows that lurked in the underbrush and rustled along the path, and he chose to walk with a spear in hand rather than slung across his back. The simple townsfolk he had left behind and their fireside tales of sprites and specters weighed heavily on his mind. They were in wilder country now. Chapter 13 The Sister's Footstool. It was nearly midnight when Ember glimpsed the first light floating in the woods. Soft and bright and amber-hued, like a distant lantern, but too perfectly round and too high in the branches. He turned his head to stare, spear at the ready, but it winked out before he could pinpoint its exact distance. On any ordinary night he might have dismissed it as his own fool imagination. But tonight, in this place, under the shadow of the sisters, he knew better. "Kentucky," he whispered. "Did you see that?" "The earth is twisted," murmured the Sirena, her gaze flickering from tree to crooked tree as they walked. Ember clenched the spear. "Twisted." She stopped and pointed to another light deep in the woods, this one a pale green. It disappeared as if she had snuffed it with her finger. "These hills are close to the mountain. Do not be bothered by the magic, but do not pay heed to such things, or it will surely lead you astray." He wondered at her reference to the magic as a single entity and could not work out whether it was intentional or merely one of her strange habits of speech, but before he could speak, Kentucky grasped his wrist in her thin clammy fingers and drew him closer. He shifted the basket to a more comfortable position on his arm and allowed her to lead him as one might lead a wayward pack mule. A heavy, musty odor had settled over the forest. It made him drowsy. "How did you find out?" he asked. "Have you ever followed one of those lights?" Instead of answering directly, she simply stated, her voice soft, "Fear not. These woods shall never beguile me." Now that he knew what to look for, he glimpsed many such lights as they walked, first individually and then in groups of 2 or 3. They might as well have been shifting moonbeams flickering through the branches, yet Ember felt a profound sense of relief, and a strange, aching disappointment, each time they disappeared. "Sunlight will drive them away at dawn," Kentucky finally said, taking note of his discomfort, "and I do not believe we shall see them again once we reach higher ground. We will rest here until sunrise." Shuddering, Ember dropped to the ground under the nearest tree, tossing aside his basket and spreading out the blanket on the bare earth. "I don't like this magic," he muttered vehemently. "Nor does it like you," Kentucky declared. He glanced up at her, patting the ground in an attempt to flatten out his makeshift bed. "What?" Kentucky sat down a few paces away and rested her elbows on her gangly knees, looking rather froggish. In the darkness her black eyes resembled empty pits, gleaming only when she turned her head slightly and a bit of starlight reflected in them. "There are many whispers in this place," she crooned, "and fewer kindly. These spells are ancient and the magic has cruel intent. I do not understand it, nor does it understand us, but one thing I do know, it has a purpose, long ago." "What purpose was that?" She indulged in what Ember considered to be a rather smug smile. "I have seen the door in the mountain and I cannot be fooled, but the trees do not like us and paths are ever shifting. They wish us to stay far away." "Ghost paths," he thought. "You can tell the trees their regards are mutual," admitted Ember, scratching his head. They were in a relatively low-lying area, almost a hollow, and the phantom forest rose up on either side as if lying in wait to swallow them up in their sleep. "I don't much like it here myself." "We go on," Kentucky said, casually preening her hair. "Magic does not frighten me." He considered that. From anyone else, it would have sounded like madcap folly, but he actually believed the Sirena. It must not frighten Hunter either. "Who is this Hunter you speak of?" Ember lay back, folding his arms behind his head, and took a deep breath of fragrant night air. It was loamy and crisp and tempered, as always, by that peculiar siren musk. "Nobody in particular. I wish to know more." "HMMH," murmured Ember, yawning wide. "He's a storyteller and a wayfarer, and some people call him a thief. I don't know if he's that, but he's certainly an opportunist. I always—" He trailed off, remembering things, little, simple, personal things, that he had left in the past, and suddenly unsure of how much he wished to share. "When I was younger I'd watch him set off for the coast after he'd worn out his welcome in town. He told the most interesting tales, and when I asked him, tales?" put in Kentucky quizzically. "You know, stories and songs and such-like. When I asked him where he heard them all, he simply said the sea." After a brief pause for thought, he confessed, "I always hoped he'd take me with him someday." Kentucky felt very quiet and still, her hands tangled up in her hair. Then she continued her preening and remarked, "You say you are fond of your nest, once." He stared up at the misty branches overhead, watching distant lights twinkle through the leaves and needles, and smiled a little. I still am. But I wanted to see the ocean. Have you? No. Ember sighed, closing his eyes. Have you? Ember, she whispered, her voice trailing across his skin like a living thing, the ocean is my nest. Tell me about it. It is great and cold, and deep and wide, and blue like a darker sky. Beneath the water, where the sun yet warms the surface, fish with silver scales swim in glittering clouds. But there are many tastier fish to snatch in the darkest reaches. Your people call those reaches fathoms. Many far fathoms down, they are. The sea is beautiful and wise, and shelters us from the sun. You could never live there, Ember, for all the men who visit its hidden depths do so against their will, and they do not live long enough to appreciate its beauty. As she spoke, an image slowly took shape upon the canvas of his mind. At first a crude painting, it grew more detailed and alive with every word. Her voice rose and fell, tugging his heart with it. There are large serpents and many-legged monsters with eyes like the stone from the mountain, and teeth that would surely tear you apart. The ocean tries to devour the shore, crashing upon the dust of the earth again and again, but cannot reach far before it is drawn back unto itself. It is. The ebb and flow of her words paused as she searched for the right one. Relentless. It sends more waves to shore, seeking to claim the land for its own. On stormy days and stormy nights the ocean pounds and pounds and pounds, but it can never attain its desire. It is forever in want of more, and forever it shall hope in vain. The vision that splashed behind his eyelids slowly faded. Ember shivered, caught in the remnant imaginings of the sirena's tongue, and slowly opened his eyes. Kentucky was bathed in bluish glow from her head to her feet, and before her hovered an orb of light. It throbbed like a beating heart. She reached out to touch it with a finger, but it danced just out of reach. And he knew, somehow, that this peculiar little creature was the color of the ocean, all the blues, greens, and varied hues of flashing sunlight on the waves were contained within its glowing form. Kentucky bared her fangs. It barely retreated. And then it drifted closer, as if daring her to rebuke it. She curled her tongue in a savage hiss, and the light finally darted away, leaving them to the shadows. Ember let out the breath he'd been holding in a disappointed sigh. "Why did you chase it away?" he murmured, frowning at her. Kentucky absently picked at her teeth with a claw. "My tale was for you," she said, her eyes very dark. "Not for it." He felt flattered, and a little sorry for the wandering light despite his initial dislike of them. "Go to sleep," she advised. So Ember reclined and closed his eyes again, facing the Serena with his back to the deeper woods. Kentucky did not make any attempt at furthering her narrative, but she did hum very quietly, and it was the last thing he heard before a parade of strange and wonderful dreams overtook him. He awoke in the dark and misty hours of the morning to a mournful whistle. It echoed beneath the mountain, almost a cry, almost a laugh, and if he had to liken it to something he understood he would have described it as a loon calling out across a wide lake. Low and long, it shivered something deep inside his soul. Cold sweat broke out across the back of his neck. From the first clear note until the echoes rolled away down the mountain, his vision blurred, as if to better let his ears appreciate the sound. When the whistle died away he noticed the siren sitting up rigidly, her ears fanned out and her chin very stiff. She glanced here and there in quick jerking motions, like a watchful bird. Her humming had stopped. "Kentucky," he whispered. "What was that?" She glanced down at him sharply. "Go to sleep," she said again. "What was it?" he demanded. "Go to sleep, Ember. All is well." Though he felt that all was not well, he squeezed his eyes shut and took a deep breath of dusty leaves and sweet pitch. He could still hear the echo in his mind, long after it should have faded away. "Ember!" came the cheerful cry. "Oh," mumbled Ember, his voice muffled in his armpit. He'd rolled onto his stomach during the night and there was a lumpy root sticking him in the ribs. He yawned, his chin scraping across dirt. He must have kicked his blanket away. "Ember," she said, her voice drifting closer. "Get up. I'm tired." "Get up, up, up," urged Kentucky, poking his arm. The mountain is not far now. Ember sighed a very snuffly sigh into the dirt. He was under the impression that he'd been enjoying some exquisitely pleasant dreams, but he couldn't remember anything more than a hazy glimpse of a vast blue horizon. "I need more sleep, Ember," she wheedled. Her coaxing did little more than to make him suddenly aware of how much he loved hearing her say his name, and he felt compelled beyond reason to make her say it again. Instead of sitting up, he curled into himself and hid his face. She poked him a second time. When that failed, he heard faint rustling behind him. "Get up, or I will eat everything in your basket." "Eat it." A short silence followed. Perhaps I will take the basket and leave you behind," she mused, scampering off with a little sniff. No, wait." Ember snatched up his spear and stumbled to his feet, frantically scrubbing sleep from his eyes. He tripped once, and then practically flew up the trail. "Kentucky, wait. Don't do that." She was waiting patiently for him at the crest of a hill, munching on the last of the dried mushrooms. "You were coming after all?" She grinned. Shaking his head, Ember trotted up the hill. "I don't think I can find my way back alone," he said. "That is easy," Kentucky chided. "Go downhill." "Easy in theory." Ember glanced up at the mountain crags, a frown tightening his forehead. They looked dourly back at him, draped in mist and morning light. All was bathed in pale gold and dusky pinks, and now that a few birds were singing, their path no longer seemed so dangerous nor so forlorn. "Where do we go from here?" "Uphill." "Of course. Silly me." After a relatively short hike, they reached a place where Kentucky's elusive path began to level somewhat, and the trees grew leafier and were fewer. They were out of the thick woods known to most in town as the Sisters' Footstool, and ascending into the heights. More flowers bloomed along the cliffs, stray bluebells, patches of mountain heather, and entire fields of white nodding daisies, all alongside many strange and beautiful plants he did not recognize. Some of them appeared familiar at first glance, but upon closer inspection proved to be distant relatives rather than a flower he knew. He found it ironic that the sisters, so renowned for death and darkness, were sheltering a veritable garden at their feet. Kentucky followed his roving gaze curiously, and when she returned from one of her waterfall trips she came bearing an armful of flowers, fresh, exotic ones the likes of which he had never laid eyes on. They were white on the outside with deep black throats, and spotted in blood red. She plopped them into his basket and then held one of them under his nose. It smelled both bitter and sweet, an enticing fragrance. "Thank you," he said hesitantly, taking it from her fingertips as they continued their walk. "Are they magical?" "In their own way." After a few moments of thought, he turned again to the Serena, who was wringing water out of her hair and splashing it across her face, and asked, "How is it that you can be away from the river so long?" She tossed him a coy glance. "What do your tales say?" "Only that you live in the water." "You said so yourself," he pointed out, wagging the flower at her. "I need a little," she confessed, "to live. I will not like to be parted from the water more than a few hours' time. Fortunately your sisters are very generous, and where there is no waterfall there will always be a pond or stream." Ember bit his tongue for a few minutes, but in the end, he had to know, what would happen if you never touched another drop of water, ever again? She looked up at the Twin Peaks and fell silent. "Kentucky? I would wither," she admitted, finally returning her attention to Ember and touching one of the petals of the flower. "As this will, soon. And die. I never hear of such a thing among my people, but if any perish for lack of water, they do not live to make a song of it." She surprised Ember with a short laugh. "We keep to the seas, to the lakes and the rivers. Death or no death, I will not be liking to live my life as a husk." And he left it at that. Chapter 14 Rotten Treachery. The higher the sun rose, the more cheerful Kentucky became. Her steps were light and she flashed him a wild grin every now and then, and he hoped it meant they were nearing the end of their journey. There was no denying that they ascended the mountain itself now. The trail they followed began to hug rocky outcroppings and bluffs that were steep enough to break his legs should he slip down them. Through the mist that spread along the Sisters' Footstool, where they had been working just that morning, He could see a broad expanse of forest stretching out to the horizon with a few patchy clearings that might have been farmers' fields. The river he knew so well seemed different from this angle, each bend and contour of the water visible at a single glance. "It all looks so small from here," he breathed, squinting against the sunlight and watching it flash on the water far, far below. He thought he could see the spot where his cabin had once rested snugly under the needled branches. Kentucky crouched beside him for a few seconds, peering down at the valley. A gust of wind swept her tangled hair away from her face and she turned to smile at him, her skin ashen from the blowing dust. All she said was, "Not long now," and continued along the path, forcing him to follow or be left behind. Bracing a hand on the warm gritty stone for a moment, Ember took one last look at the distant river. It twinkled at him, seeming close enough to touch. When he caught up to the Serena, she was standing at a divergence in the path, glancing between the two. One led higher up the crags, a narrow and perilous trail, and the other slipped downward to what he could only assume was gentler terrain. "Are you lost?" he asked breathlessly, stopping just behind her. Kentucky turned to stare at him. "I am not lost." A slim clawed finger pointed at the higher trail. "The door is beyond this ridge." "Then let's go." Ember started toward it, but Kentucky held up a hand. He bounced up and down on his aching feet, tired and anxious for their hike to be over. "What?" She sniffed twice, loudly, and crouched low where the paths separated. "I go that way while you linger, and the trail is gone." "Gone?" Ember thwacked the side of the mountain with his spear. "How do you mean?" "The rock." Kentucky paused to gesture with her hands. "Has slid. We cannot go that way." "Then what's to stop us from trying the other path?" he said impatiently. She frowned. "Smells foul." Ember sniffed once, but whatever scent Kentucky had caught must have been faint indeed. "Decay," she elaborated. "Rot. Treachery." "Treachery?" Kentucky squinted one eye and flicked her ears at him. "Treachery. Well, we don't have much of a choice, do we?" He grunted, doubtful that even the Serena could smell such a thing as treachery. He pointed at the downward sloping trail. "Can we reach the door from here?" "Perhaps," she admitted. "Then let's get it over with." HMMMM. Ember set off down the path, slipping once as a few loose rocks rolled out from under his feet, and slung his basket over his shoulder. "Come, Kentucky," he called, happy to be beckoning her for once. As he expected, the stony crags became gentler, more lush, and lined with trees again. Nothing appeared to be an immediate threat, and he slung the spear across his back. The trees they passed were smooth and black, almost petrified in nature, and their leaves were a sickly shade of green. There weren't so many flowers here as there were further down the mountain, but a few bushes lined the path, and when he stopped to examine the road he realized with some excitement that it was not merely a deer trail. "Kentucky," he said excitedly, slinging his spear over his shoulder and kneeling on the grassy slope. He scratched some of the packed dirt away. Old stones crumbled beneath his fingertips. "You were right. Men did live here." "Of course I am right," she said, her voice distant. He glanced back and saw that she was keeping well away from the trail. His heart pounded in his chest. "So we are going the right way." This must have been part of the original road that led to the door. "The mountain never parts with its secrets," she murmured, so easily. "I do not like this path. It stinks of dead flesh." "I don't see anything strange, do you?" But Ember knew what she meant. Even he could smell it now. It was a cloying, fermenting odor, reminiscent of the leaves he used to cover the root vegetables in his garden. It also reminded him of a rotting deer carcass he had found once in the woods, but he tried not to think about that. He took a few more steps, and then stopped in the middle of the road. His scalp prickled. A foreboding hung over the ancient cobblestones, warning him away even as his waking eyes assured him that nothing was the matter. A faint breeze drifted past, blowing a mist across the ruins, and the air shimmered. He blinked, but the road lay smooth and straight before him. Was the heat playing tricks with his eyes? Mistrustful, Ember stepped forward once more, testing the ground. Nothing happened. Better to be cautious. He decided to walk around the cobblestones, toward the woods, but had not gone more than 6 paces when a bit of dirt shifted underfoot and tiny stones blinked and echoed nearby, as if he had kicked them over a ravine. In an instant, the illusion of solid ground rippled away to reveal a deep crevice in the earth, gaping wide like a pair of ravenous jaws. It stretched from one side of the road to the other, several body lengths in width, and he was leaning too far to catch himself. The rift beneath him gave a grumble of monstrous proportions, and as he tipped forward he glimpsed many shadows swirling below. Deeper still, a single ray of sunlight pierced the darkness to reveal bleached and rotting bones shattered across many breakneck precipices. All this he saw in a moment, and he had less than that to react. Ember let the basket slide from his arm and threw out both hands, fingertips barely scraping the rocky soil on the opposite ledge. His knees banged into the stone and he lost his grip, scrambling to find a handhold before he fell and broke every bone in his body. Ember. A pale blur appeared in his periphery and something slammed into the wall. A thin arm lashed out and pinned his shoulders in place. When he turned his head, the sirena was clinging to the rock beside him, mouth agape. He glanced down just as the basket bounced off the edge of the ravine. The remaining apples went tumbling in opposite directions, his blanket unraveled, and the basket vanished into oblivion. "Up," she said loudly, shifting her grip to his arm and giving him a shove. He felt along the mouth of the ravine and wedged his fingers between crumbling cobblestones, dragging himself over the edge. When he turned back, Kentucky grasped his hand to pull herself up, and a low rumble echoed below. Before he could so much as shout a warning, one of the tempestuous shadows slithered upward and the siren squeaked in angry surprise. Her claws dug into the mountain, dislodging bits of dirt and debris, and Ember lurched forward as she was drawn back into the void, grabbing hold at anything he could to keep from toppling in. Kentucky began babbling in a foreign tongue, a twisty tangle of sonnets and syllables that Ember was at a loss to comprehend. Shadows shrank away, but the ceaseless grumble rose to an angry, high-pitched buzz. Strength surged through his limbs. He pulled as hard as he could, each grasping the other's elbow. At last something gave. He hoped it wasn't one of Kentucky's bones, and he managed to tug her upward slightly. A low burble echoed from the bowels of the pit and the shadows roiled beneath them like a sea of black snakes. She snarled and burrowed her claws into Ember's forearm as she slipped, tearing the cloth and the flesh underneath. Ah! Ember's eyes watered and he dug his toes into the turf, half-blinded by pain. He kept his other hand knotted around tufts of thick grass, and the sirena continued to scratch and scrabble, ripping away clods of hard-packed dirt. She kicked out with both feet and he saw that the shadowy mass had coiled itself around her ankles. "Leave off!" he shouted hoarsely, which did absolutely nothing. The sirena let out a single shriek, raw, fierce, and excruciating, that set Ember's ears to ringing and made him cry out in turn. The shadow withered, watery arms retreating into the void. Kentucky jerkingly reached up with her free hand, wrapping her fingers around Ember's head, and clambered over him to freedom. As soon as she was out of danger, he rolled away from the pit and struggled to his knees. Thin drops of dark blood spattered the cobblestones, but he couldn't tell whose it was. His head swam and his arm felt warm and numb. "Quickly! Away!" she hissed, grasping his wrist and towing him to his feet. Ember didn't argue. He stumbled after her, chest thudding and ears still painfully ringing. They sprinted down the road until he felt his lungs would burst, Kentucky leading the way and hawkishly watching the terrain ahead of them. When he finally dropped in the middle of a grassy knoll, she let go of his hand and sat down, blinking rapidly. He had no words to offer for several minutes. It was all he could do to draw breath, but Kentucky hummed and muttered to herself like an agitated animal. It unsettled him, chafing at his already frayed nerves, and he finally felt he had to interrupt her. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I would have fallen." Her silence took him by surprise. When it became clear he expected a response, she said, "I know. Aren't you going to thank me, too?" he asked sheepishly. She stared flatly at him. "I say not to go that way at all. It stinks. It smells nicer here," he pointed out. "Anyway, where else would we have gone?" It's not as if you were suggesting an alternative. More silence. Ember sighed, giving up. I just hope there's nothing like that lying in wait behind your door. It is not my door. I know, I know. He sucked in a quick breath, poking at his arm. It throbbed, but the stinging sensation was gradually diminishing. It's the mountain's door. Kentucky shifted, her fingers twitching, and Ember glanced up. Are you hurt? I am well. But as she spoke, she pulled up the hem of her trousers and revealed a rather gruesome-looking set of lacerations and purple bruises. Instead of shuddering or gasping, as Ember expected, having lived with a sister for so many years, she licked the palm of her hand and began to scrub away the dirt and trickles of bluish-red blood. While she fussed with her injuries, Ember peeled back his torn sleeve and examined the damage done by her claws. The blood had mostly congealed, but a few fresh drops trickled down his wrist when he flexed the muscle. Good thing I didn't drop you, he muttered, feeling a little spiteful. Kentucky made a sticky noise in the back of her throat which was almost a whine. Then she reached for his arm, licking her fingers again. That won't be necessary, he said hastily, yanking his arm out of her reach and covering it protectively with his hand. Besides, I saw some nitbun growing along the trail. Nitbun? Broad, flat leaves, little yellow flowers shaped like stars. Ah! I will procure some for you. And Kentucky rose to her feet, brushing off her hands and smiling down at him. It is not far. For all her indignation, she still seemed eager to make amends, and Ember did not know what to think of this contradiction. He sat up a bit straighter, still holding his arm, and glanced anxiously up the mountain path. It loomed ahead of them, ominous and gray. Hurry back. You will not miss me, she called, sprinting down the trail. I might, he admitted dryly, somewhat under his breath. But she was already gone. Wincing, Ember peeled back his sleeve and stared at the lacerations. They were both shallow and deep. The punctures where she had first latched hold were by far the deepest, and trailed into mere scratches from there. Kentucky had not been gone more than a minute or two when Ember began to feel uneasy. The sun shone down very hot and each time a breeze rolled past he shivered, sweat drying on his bare skin. His wounds itched and he gritted his teeth, resisting the urge to scratch at them. A faint whistle caught his ear and he glanced suspiciously into the woods beside the path. At first he thought it might have been an echo, but then it came again and every hair on his body prickled at the sound. He'd heard it before, echoing down from the sisters. A footstep rustled in the leaves nearby. Ember stood up, painfully grabbing the fishing spear in his injured hand and taking a deep breath. The air was heavy with musk. And flowers. He sighed, lowering the spear. Thank the Maker. No reply. Ember peered into the shadows. Kentucky? The scent intensified. It was not unlike the scent which followed his traveling companion, but now he noticed that it was more herbaceous than floral. He took a step forward, craning his neck, and glimpsed a slender shadow melting behind a tree. There was a swift flash of red, like a bird in flight, but it was gone a moment later. Don't play games with me, begged Ember, aiming the spear where he had last seen the elusive figure. His hand shook. Do you have the nitbun or don't you? A low hum vibrated through the blackwood trees, more sonorous and ethereal than the sweetest human voice. Power caught in a single note, like a butterfly quivering in a spider's web. It pulsed in time with his beating heart, and as he hearkened to it, oddly disjointed sounds echoed around him, soft feathered wings which fluttered past, twigs that snapped and crackled endlessly, and the summer insects droning in the bushes. All of this merged with the humming tone. Ember advanced, swallowing once and nervously wetting his lips, spear in hand. He glimpsed the shadow one last time. It drifted between the trees, fading deeper into the forest before simply vanishing from view. Only a shifting patch of sunlight lingered in its place. Wait. Just wait. Don't be a fool. He stuffed that voice of warning deep inside his mind, where it was only a muffled complaint, and took another step toward the woods. A passage awaited him where there had been none, foliage curling round and round in a strange leafy tunnel that seemed to shrink and elongate before his eyes. A lonely footpath through the trees. Why hadn't he noticed it before? Had it been there all along? Ember's heart was near to bursting in his chest. He swallowed again to steady himself. Don't be a fool. But he had seen too much, heard too much, and his feet carried him onward, through the flowered bushes and into the rustling woods. Chapter 15 Blackwood. Ember had entered a world of shifting shapes and shadows, a world comprised entirely of leaf patterns on sunlit moss and blurry half-corporeal things which drifted in and out of view, tricking him into thinking they were real only to fade away a moment later. The air was hot. Stifling, muggy, almost. He wiped sticky sweat from his forehead and stumbled on, desperate not to find his way out of these whispering woods but to find and comprehend the source of that humming. Kentucky was surely back by now. Would she come looking for him? There's a trail, he thought. I can always follow it back. But when Ember glanced over his shoulder he was dismayed to see that all trace of the woodland path had vanished. The leaves furled on before him, laying a clear passage through the trees, but it ended at his heels. He supposed it would be possible to turn around and walk uphill until he found the road, and had almost made up his mind to do exactly that when the droning hum ceased. Ember squinted into the foliage. That faint shadow slipped further away. "Who are you?" he shouted, hefting the spear. Pale skin shimmered beneath speckled sunlight, a white hand pressed against the dark, smooth bole of a distant tree, and a gentle breath wafted through the woods. "Come closer," came the lullaby sigh, "and you will know me." "Show yourself first," Ember said, but it sounded weak even to him. "Come," it whispered. "Come." And Ember went, desperate to catch just one more glimpse of the elusive creature who continued to melt into the tangled trees. He told himself, each time, that he wanted one more look, convinced himself that the next glimpse would be clearer, surely, and his curiosity sated. But it, whatever it was, remained just out of view. In all truth, he had ceased to care about Kentucky Lee's existence, his purpose there, or anything else which had occurred within the past few weeks. His life, as a whole, had shrunk to this disappearing path and the voice that sang to him from beyond the blackwood trees. A bubble-like shape floated into his periphery through the streaks of sunlight, quietly followed by another. Ember glanced away from the path and was surprised to see two pale orbs, glimmering as they moved through the shadows and oddly translucent when in light. They floated gently along the trail, rising and falling, and others appeared from behind the trees and under bushes to follow in their wake. Summoned by the song. The song that had summoned him. Magic. The air thrummed. As if someone plucked the air itself, like a stringed instrument, a note here, another there, all vibrating against each other until they made a subtle and silent chorus. There was no music to the shivering of the atmosphere, no real melody, yet it lay beneath the song itself in a gloriously mournful accompaniment. Ember glanced to the right and saw more luminous orbs kept time with his walking stride. They were all pursuing the same goal, all drifting along the same path down the mountain. A strange giddiness overwhelmed irrationality, and he began to trot along the trail. The orbs moved at their own pace, some more quickly and others floating along behind. Each was a slightly different color, some as large as his head and others much smaller, and he wondered if they were living creatures or merely the embodiment of the magic and ancient spells that surrounded the sisters. "Come. Come." To the wildwood. A pale green orb danced before him, darting into the shadows. "Come." The voice seemed more an echo than a voice unto itself, and he felt his heart stirring, reaching for more. "Down. Down. To the sea we shall fly. Down where the salt winds blow." A slight breeze rustled the forest, and for a moment Ember thought he tasted a hint of salt upon his tongue. It gave him pause and he hesitated, tapping the path with his fishing spear. If the magic here was strong enough to alter his perception, perhaps it would be best to turn back and wait for someone. Someone he was certain he should remember. But here, in the thick of the woods and the sweltering heat, caressed by soft beams of light and 100 floating orbs, it was difficult to remember much of anything. "Mortal soul, come, sup with me. Where the white waves froth below." And then, like a flash of lightning, one of the floating lights zipped into his path. He gripped the spear tightly, startled from his waking dream by the blue orb flashing in his face. A dissonant buzz interrupted the song, and the floating light wiggled up and down before him in an excitable manner. It pulsed in time with his own heartbeat, occasionally flashing hues of brighter green or brilliant whites that nearly blinded him. Ember shielded his face with a hand and ducked around it, cringing at the intense buzzing, but the wisp of light moved with him and continued its anxious dance. "Get away," Ember hissed, poking at it with the spear. "Get." It darted up into the branches overhead, still flashing a rainbow of oceanic colors. "Down. Down. Down. We shall fly. From the wild green woods to the shore. Son of man, come closer to me. Be a part of me evermore." Throwing aside all semblance of caution, he ran headlong down the trail, annoyed with the meddling magic and frantic to catch the shadow in the woods before it disappeared forever. The pale blue orb followed relentlessly, zipping around him in dizzying circles, faster and faster until it seemed he was encased in a fence of white light. Huffing, Ember shut his eyes and pushed past the light, following the shadow by voice alone. He could still hear it calling him under the louder buzzing of the orb. Moments later, the troublesome noise vanished. When he opened his eyes, the wisp of light was gone and he saw the shadow again, fading into the woods. "Come back," he pleaded, taking 3 more steps. "Where are you going?" "Ember." A new voice, familiar, soft and alluring, echoed from behind. The shadows thickened around him, warping into an odd leafy tunnel, and a light shone brightly at the end of it, broad white daylight, beckoning him to take just a few more steps out of the darkness. "Ember." The forest blurred around him, but when he turned to look he glimpsed a hazy streak of blue. The orb. It danced around his head once and then floated into the branches far above. Even as the melody reached a fever pitch, abandoning words for a pure droning music once again, he held out his hand toward the more familiar voice which called his name, reaching, Ember. The sudden shout came like a dagger, piercing his shadow world and shattering the illusion of stillness to pieces. A cold hand latched onto his, dragging him out of the tunnel and into the light. The trail vanished as he stumbled away, thickets and branches twisting around him like live snakes and snatching at his hair and clothing. Each floating light scattered in a different direction, like startled butterflies. A burst of noonday sun streaked through the foliage, blinding him. He shut his eyes and swore, but a clammy hand slapped across his mouth, fingers digging into his jaw. "Hush!" Kentucky's voice. Freezing in place, Ember glanced sideways at the Sirena. She stared wide-eyed into deeper woods, her ears pricked forward and her gaze roving about the trees. In the sudden eerie silence of the forest, everything became audible: his heartbeat, Kentucky's uneven breathing, the grass shifting under their feet, and a faint rustle. Far away, Ember caught another flash of pale skin through the bushes, and a low hum echoed up the mountain. His vision blurred, as if the creature were weaving him another dream world. With an effort, he shifted his gaze to Kentucky, who stared with her lips parted in silent wonderment. Then the Sirena blinked twice, shivered, and snarled. That woke him. She snatched his hand, and before he could ask her what it was, they were off. "You must not stop." His tongue felt sticky and swollen, and it was an effort to form even one simple word. "What?" "When I let go of your hand," she shouted, "you will cover your ears and sing." "Why?" Ember shouted back, confused as to why they were shouting at all, and left with only the vague impression that if Kentucky was frightened by the shadow in the woods, he should be wholly petrified. "Sing loud and clear. Sing, shout. Any song you know, or nothing at all," she urged him, moving through the underbrush at a breakneck pace, "but you must not cease your wise-making. Do it now." She let go of his hand. Ember gathered enough of his wits to stuff his fingers in his ears as they ran, clambering over fallen branches and rotting logs and nearly falling several times. It was an uphill climb. He could not think of any song but that which he had heard calling him in the woods, so in the end he yelled Kentucky's name over and over to drown out the melody. The light grew brighter with every step until they burst from the trees and were ascending a steep, grassy slope up to the crags. When they at last reached the summit, every muscle in Ember's body quivered with exhaustion. He slowed down when he glimpsed a large chasm at the top of the hill, separating them from a little glen surrounded by thick trees and rocky ledges. Kentucky did not slow down. In a few short moments, the chasm would swallow her whole. "Stop!" Ember shouted, horrified. But Kentucky stepped right off the edge, and disappeared, her body melting into the ether like a wandering ghost. Ember stood in the middle of the grassy flat, mouth agape. He took a step back, glancing over his shoulder at the shadowy thickets, and then returned his gaze to the drop-off. A misty hand appeared out of thin air and waved to him. Kentucky's hand. He flinched. Her irritated face popped back into view soon after. As her mouth moved frantically, he caught the word "come," but nothing more. When he made no move to follow, she leaped back into the world of the living and snatched his wrist. He yelped in protest as his hand was yanked from his ear, but before he could think twice they were at the precipice. He tried to leap, to bridge that impossible divide, but it turned into a stumble and he tripped over his own feet. The sunlight intensified and he found himself wobbling awkwardly in a bed of dense green grass. Ember sucked in a breath, disoriented by the lack of a sudden drop. It was as if they had stepped into another time and place as the droning sounds of the forest popped out of existence and a new set of sounds brushed his ears, a few birds singing gently in the trees beside the mountain, and wind whispering down from the heights. These are the heights, he realized, blearily staring up the face of the jagged mountain. They were somewhere between the two peaks, as best he could make out, but he was too overwhelmed to notice much else. "We are safe here," she declared, sounding pleased. Ember's knees weakened and he sagged to the ground, but Kentucky did not let go of his hand. The trees and Rocky Mountain and her smiling face all swirled together in a dizzying dance that made him shut his eyes. Maker above. He lay there for a moment, flat on his back, breathing deeply. The air felt different here. Cleaner. Fresher. A soft breeze blew over his head, drying his skin and brushing a few sticky curls of hair away from his face, and Kentucky's amphibian skin was cool and unfamiliar against his. Her fingers tightened. When he didn't respond, he heard her crouch beside him. "Ember," she whispered. "Look up." He opened his eyes and was startled to see her face so close to his. She withdrew slightly, pointing one finger up and to his left. He rolled his head in the grass, blinking rapidly until his eyes adjusted to the glare of the sun. The mountain rose up before them, very steeply, draped in moss and flowering vines. Dead brown tendrils from seasons past created a thick carpet over the sheer wall in spots, but white petals tinged with blue bloomed against the gray-green rock. And when he followed the vines upward he saw that some of them had been scratched away. Not too recently, as the ends were shriveled and dried and a few fresh blossoms had grown over them, but perhaps a month or two ago. There, etched into the stone, were runes. Human words. Ember sat up very suddenly and grasped Kentucky's hand in his, staring intently at the mossy surface as the blood rushed from his head. Spots danced in front of his eyes and he rubbed them away with his free hand. "You see," Kentucky said with an air of pride. "I said that you would see." A few of the vines were wedged into steep, narrow crevices, two lines, far apart and buried in flowers. Bits of rock had weathered away with the years, but they were still distinguishable as such, one springing up from the softer soil on each side of the grassy clearing. They went up, 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 rising to a narrow shelf where the glare of the sun became nearly too bright to look at. There, they were joined together by a third horizontal crack in the mountain's face. It was a massive block of stone. If Ember stood side by side with the siren, fingers touching and arms spread wide, they still would not surpass its breadth. "A door," Ember whispered. "The mountain's door," Kentucky corrected him peacefully. Chapter 16 The Door. "What does it say?" Ember got to his feet, brushing grass and dirt from the seat of his trousers, and took a few steps toward the wall. The runes peered down at him, somber and magnificent, not so much in stature, though they were expansive, but simply because they were. That such a thing still existed, or ever had, put to shame all the stories of the town below about the history of their people and where they hailed from. Surely it was no coincidence that they had settled in this valley, so close to the sisters. It could have been 1,000 years, he reminded himself. 1,000 years ago or more. He took a deep breath. Kentucky. Kentucky waited expectantly. Instead of answering her question, he muttered, "Are you the only one trying to open this door?" For a moment, her expression froze in place. Then she gave him an empty-eyed shrug. "Yes." Ember crossed his arms, frowning. "Did someone or something follow us here?" Her lip twitched. "Fear? Annoyance? How am I to know?" "That thing I heard in the woods, the voice. Yes, yes," she muttered anxiously. "Better to read these runes quickly. It may be looking for us." "But what was it?" He paused, mulling over his own dark speculations, but kept them to himself. Better to hear what she had to say than give her an easy explanation. Instead of replying, the Sirena glanced away with another shrug, chewing the end of a long black claw. Ember considered pursuing the matter, but found his own curiosity pulled in the direction of the door despite his better judgment. The sight of those carven words awakened a strange desire within him to seek out the men who had fashioned them, to be a part of something ancient and grand. To be significant, in some way. Desirable, even. He very much wanted to believe that he had come from a long line of skilled craftsmen, and in that moment, he did. Although time had weathered parts of the rock away, he could already make out one or two coherent words. "I think these runes make some mention of peace," he said honestly, shading his eyes against the noonday sun. Kentucky grabbed his arm. "What else?" He turned, startled, but her eyes roved the door, flickering over every etched rune and obscuring vine. That peculiar hungriness had returned, tightening her face. Ember uncomfortably pushed her away with a finger. She glanced first at him, and then her hand. "I don't know," he said stiffly. "I need a minute to think. Some of these runes are completely worn away." Kentucky's ears quivered. She turned away, circling behind him. "Think," she murmured, stalking to the other side of the clearing and seating herself upon a mossy boulder. "And when you have thought long enough, I will be listening." Ember plopped down on a tussock of grass and squinted up at the faded lettering, scratching his chin. He had never been a very good reader. He prided himself on more practical skills, and though he knew a great many spoken words and could usually sound them out on paper, his literary prowess was hardly boastworthy. Each time he moved his lips to mutter some sound or other, Kentucky would stare at him, doubtless hoping he was ready with an answer. After several moments, the Sirena reached into her jerkin and pulled out a few crumpled leaves. "Perhaps," she said, and he could not tell if it was in derision or an earnest desire to be helpful, "you will think better if you attend yourself." He reached for the knitbrin, murmuring a thanks. She withdrew a few crushed flowers from her bosom, rubbing them between her palms and inhaling their scent before handing them over as well. Ember's shirt was not an easily torn sort of material. Nothing the women of the valley wove was anything less than durable, so he pulled his knife from his belt and ripped a thin strip of cloth from the hem. Then he stuffed two of the leaves in his mouth, chewed them up thoroughly, and spat them into his palm. Kentucky watched his every move with the wide-eyed disbelief of someone who had likely never spat out a bite of food in her life. He smeared the sticky paste over his arm, wrapped it tightly in cloth, and tied it off at the elbow with his teeth and the fingers of his left hand. Then he popped another leaf in his mouth and beckoned the siren. "Your ankle." She silently pulled up the hem of her oversized trousers, and Ember was surprised to see that, less than a few hours after their mishap, the wound had already begun to shrink. Most of the blood had sloughed away, leaving only a few small cuts and brownish bruises. Her skin's natural oily shimmer seemed more glistening than usual around the wound, and he had a distinct impression that if he touched it, it would feel like pond scum or fish slime. Then she covered it up again, tucking her feet nearer the boulder. "Oh." Ember shrugged and swallowed the knitbrin. It would do him as much good from the inside as without. Kentucky observed the remainder of the leaves, and then crept across the grassy knoll to sample one. As they sat there together, both chewing quietly and both staring up at the massive door, Ember heard something odd. It sounded a bit like a snuffling dog, distorted, strange, frighteningly close and distant all at once. They turned as one, glancing at the border where he knew the false crevice to be. Nothing was visible down the sloping hillside, but Ember supposed that if something were creeping up behind them the illusion might work two ways. Ember, Kentucky breathed in his ear, making him shiver. Have you thought long enough? He stood, nervously unslinging his fishing spear and moving toward the door. Maybe. She gave him a little poke. Hurry, hurry. It says, speak the truth, he began, his palms sweating, all. Who come in peace. For. Something. Something. No. Something else, Ember whirled around as the snuffling noise intensified, and he heard the muffled sound of a twig crackling underfoot or paw. Something else what? Kentucky hissed. For none shall pass this door with. Ember swallowed, peering hard at the very last word. He was quite unsure of himself, it was not a word he had ever seen on paper before, and it was the one that appeared to be missing the most runes. Malintent? Is that all? Yes. What does that mean? I don't really know. I think speaking the truth is the most important part. Then let us waste no more time. Ember glanced back at the steep forested slope as the siren hurried toward the door. Footsteps. Something patrolled the edge of the ravine. Whatever it was, Ember suspected it was only a matter of time before it discovered the illusion. My name is Kentucky Vlee, Kentucky proclaimed, her voice resounding with an elegant solemnity that Ember did not expect and was rather impressed by. I come in peace, and I seek the lost kingdom of men. The door stubbornly remained in place. Kentucky beckoned him impatiently and he rushed forward, fumbling to string together the appropriate words. My name is Ember, son of Jarrell, and I've come to open the door for my traveling companion and friend, Kentucky Vlee. They stood side by side in front of the door, waiting breathlessly, but nothing happened. Did you read them properly? Of course I read them properly. I had to guess once or twice to form a complete word, but there's nothing else it could be. He glanced back again as the sniffing stopped. The creature, or entity, was listening for something. Could it hear them speaking to one another? He might have thought it had given up and left altogether had it not been for a strangely alluring odor of crushed herbs hanging about the clearing. A hint of sage and pine, and something tangy or bitter. The scent from the woods. Maybe the door is hard of hearing, he said, a little desperately. It didn't sound far-fetched after everything they had encountered on their way up the mountain. Kentucky looked sideways at him, but nodded her assent. They both stepped up to the door as one and reiterated their claims, as loudly as they dared. A few birds twittered nearby, but there was no massive grumble of shifting stone. Disappointment flooded through him. It is broken, Kentucky ventured. Or, Ember suggested dryly, one of us is not being truthful. Kentucky's eyes flitted from the door to Ember, and then back to the door. Broken, she pronounced. Ember bounced the spear in his hand, disquieted. You said the magic in the forest was twisted. Can spells rot? I would not say rot. She tilted her head, eyeing the door as one might eye a duplicitous adversary. This is wild magic, and old, and some of it is hurriedly woven. Doubtless the strongest of spells remain as their shaper intended, but the rest run untamed, taking on that which is not their own as they encounter other twisty spells. Delightful. Ember glared at the hewn rock. So we're stuck here, with the Maker only knows what. He lowered his voice, swiftly gesturing toward the hidden entrance, out there, and now we can't even find what we came here looking for. He wasn't sure when it had ceased to be merely Kentucky's desire and become his personal quest as well, but it had, and now it looked as if their trip up the mountain had been for nothing. I suppose, he whispered rather reluctantly, we can take turns telling it all of our secrets, and see how long that takes. The door part 2. Kentucky lifted her chin, somehow managing to look down her nose at him. I shall not. He stared back, perturbed. You think it's all my fault? I did not say that. Well, it's either that or you're hiding something. This door has no right to a siren's secrets, Kentucky said evasively, glowering at him. And I will not be made to play the fool. Then you played me for one, he snapped, the words tumbling out of his mouth before he could reflect on the wisdom of speaking them at all. I invited you into my nest, and now it's a heap of smoldering ashes. I climbed all the way up this breathless mountain with you. Now I've read your runes at the top of the stupid door, just as you asked. What more do you want? Kentucky opened her mouth, nostrils flaring, and he caught the faintest glimmer of her fangs, just as another twig snapped on the opposite side of the clearing. They both recited their lines again at the same time, Ember stumbling over the words in his haste, but nothing happened. Kentucky pressed her hand against the stone, frantically searching the trailing vines and weathered runes as if they could provide her with an answer that had somehow eluded Ember. "Open," she demanded. She then repeated the word, Ember assumed, in her own tongue. Still nothing. Crack. Kentucky crouched, facing the trees and hills that rose up to their left. Ember stepped past her, glaring at the written proclamation. Had he misread it after all? "Speak the truth, all you who come in peace, for none shall pass this door with malintent." It sounds simple enough. He reached out to touch the stone. A cat-like yowl broke his concentration and jolted the words from his head. Kentucky answered the cry with an enraged owlish screech of her own, and Ember ducked away from the awful clamor, putting a hand against the door to steady himself. It passed through with only a faint resistance, as if the mountain were made of thickened water. "Kentucky!" he shouted, and before he could dwell on the unlikeliness of what he was about to do, he took a deep breath, shut his eyes, and ran right through the door. When he opened them again, it was to a flood of pale sunlight spilling over roughly hewn stone and a flat, gritty cavern floor. Light glittered off tiny mineral deposits in the rock. Something crunched underfoot, and when he glanced down he realized with horror what he stood upon. Ah! He slid awkwardly to one side, kicking a fractured jawbone from the mound. Loose teeth scattered and rolled across the floor. "Kentucky!" Ember found a spot of solid ground amid the bones and looked back to see the siren staring at him, her lips parted in silent surprise. He reached out a hand, but scraped his knuckles on what appeared to be thin air. Swearing, he shook out his fingers and pressed his other hand cautiously against the invisible barrier. He shoved, but nothing happened. It also became clear that Kentucky was not looking at him, but rather through him, and when her gaze began to wander the door he knew she could not see into the cavern. "Kentucky, can you hear me?" "Ember," she whispered, her buggish eyes widening. "Where are you gone?" "Just run through the stone. The door is open." He gave the unseen stone another shove. The idea of being trapped alone in a cavern full of corpses was more terrifying than being trapped in a cavern with a sirena. "I can't get back out, but you can get in." She pressed her hand against the wall a hair's breadth away from his, but was met with another barrier. Her brow furrowed. Before either of them could remark on it, a low hiss came from beyond the trees, and then a gentle laugh. It reminded him of a brook tumbling over stones in the spring, though there was a bitter iciness about it that made his flesh crawl. It was not a cold laugh, but he would have described it as lacking warmth. It was the absence of anything good or mirthful that made it so disturbing. And he knew without a doubt that he would rather face 1,000 goblins from his childhood nightmares than the creature which stood laughing at the stoop of the mountain's door. Kentucky pounded her fist against the stone, and then scratched at it, a shrill sound which gave him an instant headache. "Try saying it again." "My name is Kentucky Vlee, and I come in peace to seek the lost kingdom of men and all the treasures within." She smacked her palm against the door, but it remained a solid barrier. "Open. I beseech you, open." "Nothing." "Kentucky," Ember said lowly, creeping panic overwhelming him. "It is the truth," she shouted, her face paling more than Ember had even thought possible. She was as white as the bones under his feet. "I come seeking the lost kingdom of men." The bushes behind the hill rustled, as if something were quickly running up on the clearing. The lowest branches of the tree swayed gently, and Ember saw a pale blur. Kentucky mumbled something in a siren tongue, and then repeated it more loudly, but again, nothing happened. "Those runes are human runes," he shouted. "Say it again in human words." "My name is Kively." Kentucky trailed off, glancing over her shoulder. A clawed hand dug into the turf at the top of the hill, pale and bony, and that wretched laughter echoed through the clearing. A pale shadow leaped into view, slender and quick and cloaked in a tangled haze of red, but as it did Kentucky leaned close to the door, her eyes downcast, and whispered something too low for Ember to hear. She fell forward and Ember reached out to catch her as she stumbled over the pile of bones. With an inhuman shriek, the creature leaped across the clearing and dove for the entrance, but Ember was already running down the hall with Kentucky Lee's hand clutched tightly in his. He did not stop until it was too dark to see where they were going and the entrance was only a pinpoint of light behind them. When at last he glanced over his shoulder, he could just see the skulking form of their pursuer pacing back and forth before the door, still trying to find a way inside. He knew, somehow, that this was the creature which had so cunningly lulled him away from the path, and shuddered to think what might have happened had Kentucky not followed him. When he glanced back, he could no longer see the sirena. She had let go of his hand, and he was suddenly stricken with an unreasonable panic that they would lose each other in the dark. Kentucky? A very faint glow alerted him to her location and he took a slow step in that direction, feeling before him with both hands. Soft shadow fingers appeared, cradling a small round object. She had withdrawn the stone from her jerkin and was holding it in both hands. As she brought it closer to her face, her features slowly appeared as if from a dark and heavy mist. In the odd light, she looked more inhuman than ever. Kentucky blew gently onto the stone, sweeping her clawed thumbs across its glossy amber surface, and the glow intensified with a little flicker. She continued her ministrations, like a woman kneeling on a hearth trying to rekindle the coals from a burnt-out fire. They were standing in a very large hall, with a ceiling so high that it remained lost to shadows, and he could not tell how far it went. Corpses littered the ground beneath their feet, though fewer than there had been near the door. The golden tendrils of light swirled more quickly, as if stirred by her breath, and when the stone was shining as brightly as a little sun in her palms, they both glanced down at the ancient carnage. The stone floor was stained a dark, ruddy color in places, and when Ember scraped the ground with his shoe a bit of dried blood flaked away. There were too many dead to count, and most appeared to be lying with their faces toward the door. They were trying to get out. It made no sense that such a door would be designed to more effectively keep people in than out, unless it had been twisted into some sort of trap. "I wonder what killed them," he murmured, startled by the tremendous echoes that rolled around the corridor. Suddenly it was not so pleasant to imagine these people were his ancestors. Tales of war and wasted youth around a campfire stirred up far different emotions, he decided, than to see the remnants of a battle, however ancient, with one's own eyes. Kentucky sniffed. Even that small sound rang out like a bell in the great hall. "I should not think that whatever manner of beast destroyed them is still alive after all these 100 years. Her cool logic comforted him somewhat, cleansing most of the fear from his soul. Besides, what does a siren have to fear? Then we go on. Yes. She calmly held the stone out to him. If all these men could not escape, what hope have we? A bit of dust settled in her hair, and he glanced up at the invisible ceiling. So she, too, thought the door was a trap. A fair point. He also had no desire to confront the creature lying in wait at the door, something neither of them chose to mention. Ember held the amber stone as far above his head as he could manage, squinting up at the darkness. He thought he could make out the fraying threads of some sort of tapestry, but it was difficult to see much of anything so high above them. Kentucky had coaxed a fair amount of light from the stone, a bit more than a very good lantern, but it was not as bright as natural sunlight. A shifting echo whispered before them, far away, and Ember held his breath for a moment, listening. Kentucky brushed some of the powdery debris from her hair and held out a finger. "Dust," she said simply. Ember swallowed and nodded, trying not to appear as unsettled as he felt. He knelt beside several mangled skeletons and held the amber stone as close as he could, examining the bones from all angles. They had indeed been torn apart by something, perhaps not the towering, ravenous beast that Ember had at first imagined, but something vicious nonetheless. These bones were piled up rather strangely, and most of them had been cracked or broken. He spotted a few that seemed to be identical, including several smashed skulls. It reminded him of the little carnivorous tushes he had found in various dens and nests around the valley. Holding his breath, Ember pinched one of the rib bones in 2 fingers and held it up to the light. Tooth marks. He dropped it with a clatter, scrubbing his hands on his trousers, and glanced at Kentucky. She had knelt across the hall and was turning a skull over in her hands, exploring its facets with her pale fingers. When he cast the light in her direction, he noticed that the row of teeth included a pair of glimmering fangs. Their eyes met. She smoothed her palm over the skull and set it down gently, looking up at Ember all the while. They stared at one another in the dusky light of the stone for many minutes in near-perfect silence, disturbed only by the gentle echo of dripping water or falling dust from distant, winding halls. She crouched, a pale and ghastly figure among the bones. It was only with an extreme effort of will that he did not aim his fishing spear in her direction, or snatch his knife from his belt. Instead, he slowly rose, holding out the stone light and continuing to make his way through the corridor of dry bones. The patter of bare feet soon caught up to him, but he made no effort to walk in step with her, and she remained slightly behind. Ember glanced over his shoulder, and two black eyes gleamed in the shadows. He forced a tense smile and she smiled thinly in return, her fangs hidden behind pale lips. He turned back to the endless corridor, gripping the stone light in his hand. The amber glow sputtered beneath his fingers, as if strangled by his grasp, and he quickly loosened his hold. He blew on it once, hoping it would flare up again, but it remained a dim flicker in his palms. Whatever magic Kentucky possessed, Ember, son of Jarrell, most assuredly did not. Tobe continued. Thanks for listening.